I take it that all councils are present. It's now the turn of the King's Counsel, Brad Walker. Over to you.
Thank you, Chief Justice. What I propose to do is, after some framing remarks that respond to a variety of positions that have been put about jurisdiction, both its existence and its exercise, then to move to a selection of salient matters raised this morning, including most particularly in the submissions from a learned friend, the amicus. I will then turn to some matters of what we submit are the proper analysis in response to, again, the various ways in which what the amicus evocatively calls the conundrum may be addressed. Can I start with that word, conundrum? One thing, without any flattery, that I can say to this court is that it doesn't have as part of its functions to throw its hands up and say, we don't know, this is too difficult. It may or may not be difficult, but Your Honours have a function, and we are most confident that you will discharge that function by giving an answer to the questions asked. Now, answers may include, as we ourselves have proposed for question E, answers may include explanations as to why what might be called a monosyllable yes or no cannot be given in a response. I'm not talking about those matters. I am saying that it is not a case where Your Honours can say the polity ought to go away and attend to this, even in an extra constitutional fashion, and there may then be a question that might be able to be asked. None of that's available to you. As to jurisdiction, of course it raises in an ordinary logical method, good writ of title if you like, the anterior question as to the constitution in which the statutory provisions giving jurisdiction and describing that jurisdiction are found. I don't wish to spend time in reply rehearsing, by which I mean effectively repeating, matters we've already said and written concerning the efficacy principle or the allied question of recognition or the cognate but distinct matters of necessity. May I simply pull together the strings this way? The jurisdiction is to answer questions about the interpretation and application of the 2013 Constitution. There is an assumption there that there is a 2013 Constitution. That assumption is made good, we submit, by a straightforward application of the Prasad criteria with respect to the efficacy of the regime change, and in particular, we submit, it involves an appreciation that allied to that, but distinct, is the question of recognising as binding, often as a result of that efficacy, instruments which are instruments of government in the new regime. Thus, with great respect, the distinction Mr Apted emphasised in his answer to the three questions is a proper one. It doesn't alter, I think, anything that various counsel have submitted about the operation of those intersecting doctrines, but plainly enough, in accordance with Prasad, for reasons we've sufficiently rehearsed, the regime has efficacy, and the question is whether the instrument which didn't create the regime, as you know, which was created by the regime, by persons associated with it, whether or not recognition should be given to the 2013 Constitution. We say it's virtually part and parcel, that the same facts as suggest strongly efficacy accompany and are contributed to by the fact that the Constitution has been treated as recently as last year. You see another reference for judicial opinion. The Constitution has been treated as a constitutive document providing the supreme law of the country under the regimes which have been in actual government during the existence of the 2013 Constitution. We say that is enough to provide for jurisdiction, and part and parcel of the exercise of jurisdiction is always to answer the question, what is my jurisdiction? Do I have any? And the answer is, it is a jurisdiction under the provisions of the 2013 Constitution, to which reference has been made, and it is a jurisdiction which naturally requires, as to the straightforward word application, an answer to the question, do the relevant provisions of the 2013 Constitution, query, do any of the provisions of the 2013 Constitution apply? Now, it may be that there's some self-levitation involved in submitting, well, of course, the provisions granting jurisdiction apply, but that follows, we submit, by the combination of efficacy and recognition to which I've referred. That doesn't mean that there cannot be reasoned responses to the various arguments you've heard, all of them opposed to our position, which seek to assert the continued and, as we understand it in most cases, exclusive operation of the 1997 Constitution. You have to attend to that in order to deal with the question whether the 2013 Constitution applies, and therefore to deal with the application of provisions in it. I don't want to add anything further in reply about the 1997 Constitution, because that's tied up with the efficacy question, which I don't want to add to in reply. We would say this, however, there's no ouster clause that should concern you there. This is not a case which involves examination, say, of a so-called abrogation decree, one or other of them.
Well, it does actually, doesn't it?
No, because...
I confess to not being particularly troubled by it, but I thought there's a general provision in the Constitution that precludes review of any of the decrees.
That's what I'm talking about. So 1734 in particular, but there's also...
Yeah, but so that does purport to review, to exclude jurisdiction to review.
So I think I got that. I should have said 1743, but there's also 1734.
Yeah.
One way or the other, your Lordship's recollection is absolutely correct. What I'm saying is we are not reviewing or seeking to challenge any of those abrogation decrees, because the argument about efficacy, you will have noticed, does not depend upon the dictate of those who issued those decrees. We don't say that they are part of efficacy. They are matters, acquiescence in which or acceptance of the practical effect of which will, after time and in light of subsequent conduct, no doubt inform factually that question.
I understand.
And it's for those reasons that Your Honours shouldn't, your Lordship should not be troubled by the existence of those ouster provisions.
I'm not particularly troubled anyway, because if we think that the amendment provisions shouldn't be recognised, we're not particularly likely to say, but we've got to because there's this ouster of jurisdiction clause. We just not recognise the ouster of jurisdiction clause that would defeat the regular operation of the rule of recognition.
Quite so. It would be, to put it mildly, at odds with the rule of law, which predates the 2013 Constitution in Fiji, to say any such thing.
Mr. Wood, can I just raise this one question? So that in a lot of the submissions that I've heard earlier, there seems to be a total disregard that the Supreme Court under Section 98(3)(c) is the basic jurisdiction that connects us
Yes.
to the reference made by the Cabinet.
Yes.
Now, if we look at that provision, there is no qualifying words at the beginning, like notwithstanding X, Y, and Z. The question I wanted to ask, the use of certain words like determinations and all that, is that wider than the issue of just interpretation?
A comparative assessment is not obvious to me, but we do say that the determination, that's one word in your jurisdictional provisions, and your opinion, that's the other word in your jurisdictional provisions, combined with the fact that you're a court under the rule of law, you are doing that unusual thing of giving judicial advice. It's not inter partes determination of rights and obligations, that those are words which are clearly broad enough to include not only the necessarily implied duty to ascertain to be satisfied as to your own jurisdiction, but also then to proceed to answer questions concerning interpretation and application. Now, it's at that point that in our submission, it becomes really vital to observe the focused nature of the state's posing of questions for this court. And question A sets the template. Question E, of course, is in another area. But question A, which sets the template of consideration for B, C and D, concerns whether or not there is a power in this polity, under this Constitution, to amend the amendment provisions in the Constitution. That's the focus. We do not ask a question about whether there is validity or not, say, to the burdensome allocation of functions to the Attorney-General, or the more obvious looming presence, the various immunity, amnesty, oblivion provisions to which Your Lordship's attention has been drawn. They are not in question in this case. They are, it's an apt expression to say, they're an elephant in the room. They may not...
But aren't they?
They're not in question in this case, no. We don't say, we seek from your opinion that those provisions are, to use my jargon, inoperative and ineffective.
Aren't they captured by the generality of the questions?
No, oh no. No, that's why I'm drawing to attention. The specific framing of question A refers to the power to amend the amendment provisions, not to amend the Constitution, to amend the amendment provisions. That's why I, in chief, focused on paragraph...
But the amendment provision, section 15, which includes section 159, precludes amendment of immunities.
I understand that, but I'm focusing on 1592C.
Okay.
And once 1592C, which prevents amendment provisions from being looked at, is rendered inoperative, then of course, depending upon political judgment and parliamentary will, there can be opened up consideration of all the other aspects of Chapter 11 left intact upon the rendering inoperative of 1592C. So this is the notion whereby we just cut out that one bit. We don't say that's the only bit that's undesirable in the Constitution. Otherwise, why would we have in mind a project of amending it? We want to ask the anterior question in a deliberate, very open, and with respect, rule of law approach by us. There is on the books, in Chapter 11, paragraph 159(2)(c), that appears to prevent us from doing what we tried to do in the bill. It must never be forgotten, some addresses seem to have assumed that the bill was an attempt to comply with the apparent terms of the Constitution. It obviously wasn't. It's a bill to amend amendment provisions. It's a bill...
Okay, but I'm sorry, I'm going back to the question. The second question, B, may the provisions referred to...
And that's the provisions about, amendment.
Are the provisions of Chapter 11 binding on the people of Fiji and the Supreme
So
Court?
as,
Yeah, with the effect that none of these provisions can ever be amended. Well, to get away, to revoke the immunity provisions, you would have to amend part of Section 159, which is part of...
what I'm saying is this. The language of that question aims at the purported effect that certain provisions
I understand that's the primary focus, but I thought the generality of the language would pick up
You've not heard any argument from me, nor from anyone else, really.
I've heard a bit of argument.
No, let me finish.
Quite a lot, actually.
You have, but you've not heard, amidst all of that argument, you've not heard identification of the defects, such as to have constitutional implications, of the immunity provisions.
We've heard assertions.
Not from us.
No, not okay.
And not, if I may say so, with great respect, not by way of legal submission concerning constitutionality. There's been submissions concerning the illegitimate foundation of the Constitution, which is almost unanimously the case at the bar table. You've heard political speeches rather than technical legal speeches in some respects concerning some of the provisions, but they are not in play in this court, and we seek nothing in our questions about those provisions. And that's, I must make it clear in response to Justice Young, question A does not implicate the provisions which provide immunity, which are referred to in paragraphs A and B of subsection 159.2, just the 159.2c, which purports to say you cannot alter what the Constitution says about the mode of amending it. That's what C says.
Well, I don't know what it does. This is a semantic point, and it's probably not worth going on it, but there is a provision in Section 159, which is in Chapter 11, which declares the immunities unamendable.
Yes?
The reference in question A is, are the provisions of Chapter 11 binding on the people of Fiji?
No, that's not.
Well, I'm reading it.
That's not the whole question, though.
Yeah, are the provisions of Chapter 11 and Part D of Chapter 12 of the Constitution, etc., binding on the people of Fiji and the Supreme Court with the effect that none of these provisions can be amended, regardless of the will of the people?
That's right.
Or of the people voting in a referendum? One of the provisions which can't be amended is the one in relation to immunity. Now, I know that's not what you're really focusing on. It's just that I had assumed that it was caught up in the generality of the language.
The one that matters is, how can we amend amendment provisions? Well, Chapter 11, I should say.
Yeah, I understand.
And Chapter 11, including the fact that it controls amendment by prohibiting some and regulating others, Chapter 11 is the focus, obviously, of our argument, and it is the fact that it prohibits the people from their self-determination by deciding on the form of their constitution, which from time to time can be accomplished only by amendment, of course, which is the focus of our argument. That's the contradiction with self-determination and democracy that leads to rendering paragraph 159.2c, which says, in effect, this provision can't be amended and no other provision in Chapter 11 can be amended. Now, it's certainly the case that if we succeed in making good that cannot stand with the Constitution's own implicit and explicit foundational significance it gives to democracy, equality, the rule of law, then if we succeed in that, the organs of Fijian government can then, as they see fit and as democratic will permits from time to time, further amendment of the Constitution. Now, that is why, in our submission, there is no real conundrum here, because if we are right, all that is opened up is the capacity to amend Chapter 11 provisions about amendment. And, of course, in response to Justice Young, One obvious candidate, though I shrink from saying this is anything other than a hypothetical, it being so political, as a hypothetical, given the dead letter nature of 161, given the fact that 159, as it were, rather unnecessarily permits people to amend their constitution, in our submission it's very clear that the immunity provisions, which are in paragraphs A and B of subsection 159.2, will thereby, upon C being rendered inoperative, will thereby no longer be protected by prohibition of amendment. Whether they are going to be amended is a different question. We don't seek to render them inoperative. That will be a matter for the democratic will of Parliament, and to the extent that they are to be involved, by vote, the people. Now, Parliament, of course, is not just members talking to each other, it's members as representatives following elections, answerable to the electors who voted for them and seeking to gain votes in future at the next election by a combination of policy and conduct, no doubt. And it's for those reasons that one can't look at Parliament and say that it is somehow not a tool of democracy, because this is a constitution, as have previous constitutions in this country been, a constitution for a parliamentary democracy. And it's against that background that in our submission we come to the so-called macro problem with which the amicus commenced his criticism of our approach. The macro problem in a nutshell is that were we correct in removing 1592C, then the Constitution would cease to be supreme law. Now, it needs to be remembered that all of that comes from the proposition, which appears from a matter of ordinary interpretation, that Section 160 obviously doesn't apply to those amendments which were prohibited by 1592C. Section 160 applies only to those that were permitted. And if we are right in that argument, we've got an alternative, but if we're right in that argument, then, as I put in chief, I don't want to elaborate further, the law-making power of Parliament is engaged, and there may be, by simple majority in the House, an amendment of the provision, in this case 11, Chapter 11, which stands in the way of amendment. Or for that matter, obviously enough, there is then the question of, this is the alternative, what happens to Section 160 in relation to that vote? May I make this crystal clear? We have not sought 160 to be rendered ineffective and inoperative except to the extent that this court says they apply to the vote which would replace the gap left by removing the prohibition on amendment of amendment. There is a gap left. The writers of this Constitution, totally undemocratic, and by what might be called a poison pill technique, the writers of this Constitution made it clear there was to be no approved procedure required or permitted for amendment of the amendment provisions. That's what 1592C does. And so one can't possibly say, we say, that a Section 160 swings in to say, well, 1592C is inoperative because it's against self-determination and democracy, it's gone. So there now can be amendment of amendment provisions, including the rest of 159 and 160. There can be amendment of that, but they all have to go through the gateway of 160 as it stands. As I say, that we have two arguments in the alternative. First, obviously 160 doesn't apply on ordinary approaches to what happens upon severance for invalidity or ineffectiveness. You'd have to ask the question, well, did this text intend that if this part were invalid, something else would apply. And one thing we can say for sure, that those people who devised this text could not have had in mind at all, ever, if we are wrong and have overreached in putting in 1592C, then may we at least have 160 requirements for an amendment of amendment provisions. Indeed, one thing that you would probably find on consideration of that rather bizarre hypothesis, because these are not parliamentarians, this was not a legislature who enacted a text for the fictitious inquiry as to intention. You've got these people, irregular and illegitimate, imposing a text. By efficacy, we now have to treat that as a governing instrument. But to anticipate, we certainly don't have to treat every bit of it, including the poison pills, as governing if they are internal self-contradictions of the instrument, as they are in this case. The alternative is, well, suspending disbelief as to the inquiry if we remove prohibition, does regulation of amendment by 160 somehow spring into being for provisions which were never obviously intended to be covered by 160. If you suspend disbelief and do that, then lo and behold, you've ended up with this practical impossibility of the referendum with its 3/4 of all voters. And that, in our submission, of course, just leads us to the question, which might entail, on that alternative, rendering aspects of 160 inoperative, namely that that too would, for exactly the same reasons, be an internal contradiction and inconsistency that can't be reconciled except by ensuring that the leading provision prevails. And that is, in our submission, a critical aspect of this case, that one can't say that there has to be a referendum for amendments to the amendment provisions unless you either wrongly say 160, in fact, just as a matter of text applies to such an amendment, which it can't, or unless you say, but it doesn't matter that the process of amendment opened up by the court regarding as ineffective the prohibition on amendment, it doesn't matter that that is practically unrealisable. That would be a complete reversal of the rationale by which the court on that hypothesis had found that 1592C couldn't operate according to its tenor because of the very strong provisions elsewhere in the Constitution concerning absolutely fundamental matters as to self-determination, equality and democracy, and the role of Parliament as the lawmaking organ of the country. This is not a country that has attempted an experiment in direct democracy. And so we, in our submission, say that one way or the other, far from being a conundrum, as can be seen from the way in which the bill was framed, this is an attempt to make it clear that prohibitions on amending certain provisions, including amendment provisions, should go. That was in the face of the Constitution as it's expressed. No one could ever have said or thought the bill was in accordance with Chapter 11, understood without examining the question of internal contradiction, etc. It openly defies that, and properly, all the more proper then that we come to this court. It didn't fail, it got 44 out of 50, 40 out of 55 I should say. That didn't fail, because if we are correct about the inoperative and ineffective nature of 1592C, and the declaratory theory operates as it does in interpreting and applying our Constitution, then those provisions did not stand in the way of the amendment provisions. The bill wasn't attempting something unlawful. Leading to the next question, but does it have to comply with Section 160 both the parliamentary steps and the referendum requirement? The answer is, well, no, of course not, because the power to amend amendment provisions would never regulated by 160. And in our submission, therefore, leaving open the democratising of the form of the Constitution by giving to the people, through their representatives, the control of the form from time to time of all of its provisions, including attempted poison pills. Now, that being so, we are entitled, contrary to the way in which the amicus has identified not only that macro problem but the micro problem, to say this about that argument. A constitution doesn't cease to be supreme in law simply because it is open to amendment in a way that many people might think is unwise. If wisdom were a requirement for validity of legislation or constitution, the state of the law would be very different from what it is. And obviously, we have accepted that a constitution, which even with the protection of requiring amending acts to be labelled as such, a constitution that is holus bolus open to amendment by simple legislation, the same as is required for an ordinary act, then that is a constitution which, while supreme, may turn out to be
Temporary.
not so much temporary as changing. Yes.
Malleable.
Labile, perhaps, is another way of putting it. And that may not be wise. In fact, I'd volunteer an opinion that it wouldn't be wise. But that, with respect, first of all, has to note that in history, the 1990 Constitution, Section 77, did have some provisions, selected provisions, which were amenable to amendment by ordinary parliamentary legislation, that is simple majority. And of course, previous constitutions in this country have had 2/3 and 3/4 for a selection, and those are always parliamentary votes, no referendum. 2/3 or 3/4 for selected provisions, including those that historically have been raised in a way I don't need to pursue further. Those are political choices by the people of Fiji from time to time, and they have changed from time to time, and they may change again, particularly if there can be amendments pursuant to the arguments that we put by way of removing the barrier currently placed by 1592C in its literal understanding. Once you've removed that barrier, then of course the Parliament can, as the people's representatives, enact procedures for amendment. And as you know, the intention is to do so by reverting to what in the run of history has been the norm, 2/3. 3/4 having been reserved for matters which may not arise, at least for a fair time to come, bearing in mind the equality of the electorate and the equality of representative voting in the single house.
Mr Walker, just so I'm sure I understand the core of your argument, is it to say that if one takes out 159(1)(c),
2C.
I'm sorry, 2C, one takes out the entrenchment of 160.
Yes.
That's right. And that's how you get with your simple bill.
Yes. No, it's not quite by that form of reasoning. The conclusion is the same. May I explain this?
Yes.
Entrenchment is the most unfortunate word to apply to prohibition. In the jargon, it's something beyond double. I mean, this is a Chernobyl protection. You can't get at it. It's not that there are barriers to be overcome, which can be overcome. 1592C says You just can't do it. Doesn't matter whether everyone wants it done, you can't do it lawfully. Now,
I'm just thinking of the Australian jurisprudence in relation to manner and form provisions, which might be, some of which might be doubly entrenched, to use the
yes, but they're
expression.
not prohibited.
Yeah, well, prohibition, but the removal of the prohibition in this case makes this what in Australian parlance would be called a flexible constitution.
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
And may I say, flexible should not be regarded as always a term of denigration when it comes to national government.
Context. It's just a different form.
That's right. Now, the Australian analogies are to be viewed with some caution, obviously. One thing that we call in aid is the obvious proposition that the majority in the federal double majority requirement at a referendum is what I call a simple majority. Democracy normally is understood to appertain to decisions made by a majority. Now, I'm going to come to the question of supermajorities in a moment, but certainly the notion that by removing the prohibition on altering Chapter 11, which is what we are aiming for, that's what we're doing, by removing that, we can, as the government has proposed in the next provision of the bill, to alter Section 160. Now, that applies across the board to all provisions of the Constitution. Section 160 at the moment does apply to every provision of the Constitution except those prohibited of amendment. And so we're focusing on that class, provisions prohibited of amendment. And as you've seen, and this is not a question of promises or representations, it's just a matter of parliamentary fact, have you seen there's a bill that attracted the support it did, which would change Section 160. Now, it could not seriously be said, though we think it may have been between the lines of some of the arguments we've heard, it could not seriously be said that a referendum is obligatory in the sense of legally a prerequisite of a constitution being observing self-determination principles and being democratic in relation to the amendment of the Constitution. There are a plethora of instances of constitutions which are amendable by parliamentary enactment. And this country is one of those countries until the 2013 Constitution. And nobody, we think, proposed that they were internally in discord by professing democracy but not requiring a referendum for constitutional amendment. Now, the usual way around the world...
Can I just stop you there, Senior Counsel? Yes, I'm willing to accept that. If you go to the earlier Constitution, my question is simply this. I don't want to be tied to this idea of referendum. It's just always been my view that there has to be an opportunity for people whose life are going to be impacted by this Constitution at some stage to have a say in it. Okay, you may do that through a referendum. I heard this morning, I think, by the learned amicus was talking about the Irish example, where there was almost like a sitting constitutional revision entity that constantly set for a period of time, revising the Constitution slowly, keeping balance and stability in the process.
Now, may I say, Your Lordship, we would not be heard at all against the proposition that it is a good thing, a very good thing, that people are involved. Now, that is not just about constitutional amendment. It may be all the more obvious as a desirable social phenomenon for good political government in the case of constitutional amendment because it is the supreme law. It provides the framework for government. But parliamentary democracy is not one that eschews the importance of consultation with the public to the contrary. And elections are perhaps a fairly savage way of recording the outcome of consultations, either by judgment on what's been done or judgment on promises of what might be done. So one doesn't distinguish between ordinary government conduct, executive as well as legislative. You don't distinguish between that on the one hand and constitutional amendment on the other hand with respect to the desirability of citizen involvement. It is desirable on both. However, there is no reason to suppose, once efficacy has been granted, now that's an important qualification, I'll come back to it, there is no reason to suppose that in this country, as a matter of the common law of the Constitution, no provision for constitutional amendment can pass muster, that is, will not contradict the self-determination and democracy requirements unless it has some referendum requirement.
Right, but
This is the difference between that which is desirable and that which is necessary. This country in the past has had an unbroken history of no referendum for constitutional amendments.
Yeah.
And it would be, in our submission, an inappropriate backward view of this country to say, well, nobody appreciated it at the time, obviously, or if they did, they acted in defiance of it, but you can't have a constitution whose amendment does not involve referendum.
But is that really the question? Isn't the question, it's not really whether a referendum is a good idea or a necessary element, it's rather whether this referendum requirement, however you put it, makes the mechanism unworkable, breaches Article 1.1 of the ICCPR.
That is a question, but may I just invert it? That's a question if it were proposed that Section 160 can't be amended. But we get in one step earlier. We say, if we're right about 1592C, Section 160 can be amended.
Now, does that depend upon whether you exclude from the coverage of the words this Constitution in Section 160, Section 160 itself?
No, I think that would be going too far. But with respect to the recognition method, that could certainly, as to aspects of Section 160, I mean the referendum aspects, that could certainly be entailed in an approach that says it's at odds with self-determination and democracy, not only to prohibit amendment of the amendment provisions, but to have as unamendable amendment provisions a requirement for an unrealistically demanding referendum.
Yeah, really
Yes,
what
is
I'm
the
asking is if you read 160 on ordinary principles of interpretation as extending to amendments to 160,
Yes.
doesn't that, to use the expression you don't like, entrench 160
But
if it's recognised?
Your Honour, that's my second alternative.
Yeah.
My first alternative was, well, you can't read 160 as applying to amendment of it because it was prohibited of amendment under
I understand,
1592C,
yeah.
and you can't torture 159 into saying that for those that are prohibited, if we're wrong, if we've overreached and that was invalid, then we want the 160 for that. Given the way in which these provisions were made, Your Lordships, you can be forgiven for thinking they weren't going to be satisfied with a mere 160 entrenchment of those provisions. They were going to make it even more demanding. But that's all speculation and not appropriate for judges. The fact is, the text as enacted, or promulgated, imposed, simply did not impose Section 160 requirements for those things forbidden under 1592C. They did not provide a procedure for something they were saying cannot be done at all. Now, and that is a straightforward example of what do you do when you have to carry out what's sometimes called a severance exercise. And a recent example that we've drawn to your attention is in the High Court of Australia, Bell Group, 260 Commonwealth Law Reports 500 at 527 in paragraph 71. And that is that is a straightforward observance by judges of the restraint against them writing a statute as opposed to, with appropriate reticence, removing obnoxious parts of a statute. And as I say, I don't wish to call in aid the Australian jurisprudence on section 109 of its constitution for federal inconsistencies, but it's a familiar doctrine in private and public law and generally in the common law world that one obviously thinks carefully before, upon severance, creating a statute that plainly was not intended by those who made it with its defective part. In particular, it's not for the judges to do something political by making a choice, in this case, for example, as to what procedure should apply if a referendum were to apply to amendment of amendment provisions. And it's for those reasons that, in returning to answer Justice French's question, yes, it's very much the case that either on a what I'll call critical recognition approach, by which some things won't pass muster, or on the intramural technique that we have put to the forefront of our argument, namely, you've got an instrument, but there are mutually contradictory provisions in it. A choice has to be made. The reconciliation is as we've put it. Either way reaches the same outcome, that the instrument that governs doesn't have the offending provision. And if that is so, in our submission, in this case, the offending provision would be 159(2)(c), and lest anyone supposed that section 160 applied to the legislation to amend an amendment of the Constitution now permitted by that treatment of 1592(c), then as an alternative, you would also render 160 inoperative and ineffective. Now that gives rise to the creative use of coloured pencils that your Lordships were invited to consider. What do you do with, say, the really striking 3/4 of all voters registered to vote in the referendum? A provision which, as the Privy Council's comments in, and indeed the lower court's comments in the Mauritius case, would rather suggest that there's not any serious ambition that there will be any amendments that have to jump because they won't be able to jump it. Now, in our submission, it would be, how shall I say, a creative use of the usually judicially reticent severance approach, which sees your Lordships staying out of the legislative and policy zone. It would be a creative approach to say, as might be said, that it is a form of severance to say of a fraction that you're going to just sever a bit of it. It probably passes muster in a very, very, what shall I call it, technical sense, though I confess I've never seen it. That is, I've never seen a blue pencil applied to reduce, that is, to make a policy decision so as to save validity, a fraction to a lower fraction, for example. Never seen anything like that. But assuming that were creatively possible, the common law will have surprises for all of us if we live long enough. The real question here is, how on earth would the court choose? Why wouldn't the court choose, for example, a majority greater than 50%? That is, the 50% plus one.
Well,
That being a very common...
But we are looking, if we look for criteria, the ICCPR may provide them, albeit in pretty evaluative terms.
But it doesn't descend to the terms of 50% plus one. It talks about democracy, which has
It talks about self-determination.
You anticipate me. It talks about democracy, and it talks about the self-determination, which is both by and through democracy. And in each case, if you're talking about the self-determination of a population, a body of people, there has to be some way of finding out what they want. And the history of the world suggests that in the reign of democracies, that has been by observance of majority votes.
History of Fiji.
I'm sorry?
History of Fiji's constitution making.
Yes.
What
Now,
does it say?
in constitutional making, of course, there are two distinct classes of case. There are the case where you are proceeding under antecedent provisions, where you're really making by amending wholesale. We're not talking about that here. In other cases, you are looking for the hallmarks of legitimacy, constituent assembly, widespread consultation, not necessarily referendum. Well, there were referenda in Australia, but they don't have to have referendum before you adopt a constitution. And then it is a matter of, as I say, the promulgated constitution, surviving or not, by reference to, in some cases of revolutionary regimes, efficacy tests applied. Now, the outcome of an efficacy test, of course, can and probably in all likelihood will vary radically, as between ask the question a week after while they're still cleaning the streets and ask the question 25 years later. And that, with respect, is a defect in the arguments that have been put concerning the ongoing ruling or authority of the ruling of the Court of Appeal in Garissay. No part of my job is to say that was wrong, but it's not a ruling on what the position is now. Or
It wasn't even a ruling that's particularly relevant to the position now, except as part of the narrative.
You're right, with respect. Could I then come to this notion then that the bill is dead rather than in limbo? I don't want to go into anyone's theology. I simply want to point out that it is a fact that it received the support of the votes it did receive. If we are correct, 159.2c never stood in the way of such a bill being enacted to amend the Constitution. And if we are correct, 160 was not required to be observed because it never applied to such an amendment. It is then a matter for Parliament, and I do stress for Parliament, as to questions of standing orders. Parliament's not bound by section 160 with respect to what it does once 159.2c has gone. Parliament may well, it would be wise, to engage as much participation, including by consultation, including by committee procedures, which are well established. It could be.
In that context, the Joint Parliamentary Select Committee.
Of course they can. Of course they can. And I might say, were I a spectator, not a lawyer, that would be a good thing. And I want that to happen. Different question, is that constitutionally required in order to support the answer we propose to question A? Of course it's not. It's not, the court wouldn't say, unless there is public participation, that which we would otherwise find is an obnoxious contradiction of self-determination and democracy will stand. Because it cannot be said that anything that is enacted by simple majority in a parliament is undemocratic. It cannot be said that it doesn't involve self-determination. It can easily be said there are other, and it might be politically and socially, better ways of doing certain things. That's a choice for the people. And this court has no footing in any of the cases in Fiji, in any of the principles that emerge from them, for saying, for example, that there needs to be a 2/3 supermajority in Parliament. As it happens, the government agrees with that, and its policy has urged it, tried to have it enacted in the face of Chapter 11. But this court is not in a position to say you would contradict self-determination and democracy if you permitted laws to be made by a voting majority in the House, particularly a voting majority as large as 40 out of 55. That would be a sad day for the court in terms of the criticism to which it would understandably be exposed. Now, that really means that this spectre of the state's argument as destroying the Constitution as supreme law is one of those arguments to be deplored which proceeds from the prospect of abuse. And here we don't have to speculate, we've actually seen the parliamentary conduct. So this is not the parliamentary conduct of legislators who wish to have the supreme law subjected to the outcome of simple majority votes thereafter in the House. Far from it. It wishes to have 2/3 supermajority. Now, can I say this about supermajorities? There are two in question. The one that we say would render 160 repugnant if for some reason it was something we had to comply with to amend the amendment provisions. It is the referendum provision that has the supermajority provision, which is remarkable, unrealistic and, with respect, cynical. The parliamentary supermajority is not in itself remarkable, although, with respect, there can't be any magic about the number. That's a matter for the people who make the Constitution, either by amendment or by original promulgation, to consider. We can forget those who originally promulgated. They are not a source of wisdom concerning democracy. We are left with Parliament, which is the living repository of the democratic will, answerable by elections, periodic elections. And in our submission, we can conclude about supermajorities in this fashion. That's a matter of choice for the people, including by their representatives. It cannot be said that a referendum is constitutionally in Fiji mandatory in order for there to be democratic self-determination in terms of the form of a constitution by reason of the regulation of its amendment. It may or may not be considered a good idea. As you have seen, serious, thoughtful considerations thought it was not a good idea in the aborted process that immediately preceded the imposition of this constitution. Those are not opinions that can be put to one side as either mischievous, that would be absurd, or that would be quite impossible for the people in question. And so we then have the simple question, why would the court, as a matter of principle, basing it always on the concordance with self-determination and democracy, do anything to require, directly or indirectly, not only for there to be a referendum, that's bad enough, but for a referendum with more than a simple majority, in other words, more than most people voting in favour. Unlike in a representative chamber, where the representatives are answerable to electors, some of whom support them, some of whom don't. One thing we can say of the electorate in a referendum is that if it's anything more than 50+1, then it is a proposal by which greater weight is given to those in a minority, that is, a minority of a particular size. That doesn't sound democratic. It might be what are sometimes called safeguards, but that's why supermajorities and highly overt labelling of legislation in Parliament, that's why they're devised. But it's not a safeguard, it's actually retrograde to democracy to say those, if we take 2/3 as a supermajority referendum, those comprising the 1/3 plus 1 in the population get more say in the outcome than all the others. And it's for those reasons that the court would look askance at being invited by way of expression of opinion as to the interpretation and application of this Constitution, that it is such that, for example, yes, its amendment provisions can be amended, contrary to 1592C, but they can only be amended if there is in force, I'm going to come to that in a moment, in force a procedure for doing so, which involves a referendum. Now, that would be constitution making in a way that the people could do and the people's representatives could do, but not this court. That's not interpretation and application of the Constitution. Now, I said that there is a question of the available procedure. We apprehend there was criticism of the apparently awful prospect that a majority of members in the House could make a law, which amends the Constitution. Now, for reasons I've already put, there's nothing awful about that. That is pretty standard democracy. We happen, politically, to agree that it would be better not to allow the elected representatives by a simple majority to alter the supreme law, and in that we follow in a tradition which can be seen in this country previously. That some constitutional provisions can be done by ordinary legislation, by 50+1, others by 2/3, others by 3/4, and then with what I'll call sectoral requirements reflecting the role of the Great Council of Chiefs. Now, that surely is a history that shows this court should not, could not lay down anything with respect to the amendment that will be open as a power of the people through their representatives once 1592C is gone. This court must not, in our submission, say, but only if you have something in place to control that. Tempted to say it's circular, but it's worse than that. It's one of those bundles of string you can never untangle.
Well, that's why
Because
you're assuming that the approach that's being postulated that the court will put in off its own bat of a procedure for amendment, and that if that was contemplated well, there would be no occasion for it to include a referendum. But if the court sees its task as rather to whittle back the restrictions to a point where they are not in breach of Article 1.1 of the
yes.
ICPPR, then it might say, well, a referendum wasn't essential, but it's been put in it, so we're not...
Can I stop you there?
Yeah.
Put in it by whom? Never by the people.
Oh, no, absolutely.
Never by Parliament.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I'm very
And that's
confident.
why, with great respect, Justice French's, what I would call critical recognition approach, which could say, by way of an example, we'll recognise under doctrines of necessity a revolutionary regime's conduct of the stock exchange because business has to go on. But when it comes to the recognition of their constitution, we won't recognise the expropriation of the stockbrokers' mansions. Now, because of fundamental rights. So, with respect, we don't get in this case to the point of the court deciding there needs to be a referendum, and in particular...
Well, I agree with that.
And in particular, I'm building then,
Yeah.
in particular, that being so, the court certainly would give no house room to the idea that respect should be given to the choices made by those who drew 160. Chapter 11 speaks the traps.
That's one line of approach. The other line of approach that you can engage with it if you like is that the court should whittle back the offensive provisions or restrictions on amendment to a point where they pass muster on Article 1.1.
Yes.
And if you were starting from that point, that position, you would start with what is in Section 160 and...
No.
What, wouldn't you?
No, not at all. The question is, what are those matters in the Constitution that are contrary to self-determination and democracy? So it's self-determination by democracy, not by violent mob. So we say that 1592C is easily identified as a provision that cannot stand against that test. We say, as you know, 160 simply doesn't apply to the lawmaking that is then permitted. If you remove a prohibition You can only do so by ruling that what was prohibited is not prohibited.
I genuinely understand that argument.
I'm sorry?
I do understand that argument.
I'm sorry.
But say we're not with you on that.
Well, 160 can't apply of its own force, that's for sure. And then the court would be, the tangled ball of wool is what that I was referring to, is this. If we are not allowed to amend the Constitution unless there be a procedure involving what I'll call a realistic referendum requirement, then who makes that? The court can't make that.
Well, someone might have to.
Parliament has to. The Parliament's made its choice against referendum. That's not an outlandish choice in this country at all. And so what I'm saying is you should never start from 160 as having, as it were, primacy because it's there. It was imposed by the same people who imposed 1592C. It was imposed in terms which we submit, I don't want to repeat what we've argued, are unacceptably severe to an unrealistic position so that it's not a genuine possibility of self-determination and democracy. If that is correct, there is no content left for this court to attach to in its expression of opinion on interpretation and application of the Constitution that gives any echo of effect of Section 160, because Section 160, were anyone to propose it should apply to the initial amendment of the amendment provisions, would be, as I say, exorbitantly demanding to the point that the thing the court had just decided should be done, namely, in the interest of self-determination and democracy, you should be able to amend your amendment provisions. Then you'd say, but only if you comply with something that makes that completely unrealistic. That is what the court would never do. Now, those matters that Justice Young has raised, I hope I've made clear, we absolutely accept proper subject matter for consideration in and out of Parliament by legislators and those who elect them, by people who comment and people who discuss it, political communication. And it may well be that in the working out of the polity in that proper way, the view will be put, maybe in Parliament, a bill to require a referendum, presumably unlikely to be many partisans for a referendum in the same form as exorbitantly required by Section 160. And that is a matter for the people through Parliament. Can I now come to...
Walker, can I just come back for a moment? I notice that Section 160, subsection 7, refers to any proposal to replace, revise or alter any provision of this Constitution. Let us suppose that prior to proceeding to the recognition exercise, we look at what Section 160 says and decide that it applies to itself as well as to other provisions of the Constitution. And then we apply the question, we ask the question, can this Constitution be recognised? And let us say that on efficacy grounds the Constitution can be recognised, but that our power to recognise is inhibited to a degree by, say, international customary law in relation to self-determination, and that Section 160, as we have interpreted that, puts barriers in the way of that self-determination. What do you say about that approach? I know it's not your primary argument, obviously.
Your Lordship started by drawing to my attention subsection 7 of Section 160.
Yes, that's right.
Of course,
That's just an interpretive issue.
it is, and what it says is that those quite familiar broad understandings of amendment
Yeah.
are how you should understand 1592C, among other provisions.
In this section, yes.
So it says you can't do anything which repeals, replaces, revises or alters, and is to instead to be understood broadly. The prohibition is very broad. Upon 1592C being surgically removed
Yes. Or even not recognised.
by reason of not being recognised or by reason of being identified as irreconcilably contradictory,
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that what had been a prohibition is now within section 160, because 159(1), which is subject to subsection 2, showed the intention of those responsible for the text. Only those things that were permitted had to follow the procedure, because they certainly didn't say, and if we are wrong about the extent of our prohibition or any prohibition, then they too will have to follow the procedure. This is an overreaching set of provisions, Chapter 11. And if they have overreached to the point of having 1592C not operate, so be it. The only gap is any specific provision for a constitutional amendment. And be it necessity or otherwise, the plain text of the Constitution gives you law-making competence in the Parliament, as we've argued. Now, it happens, and this is significant, and not a promise, it just happens to be parliamentary fact, that it has been proposed, I submit, it is still capable of being put into train, kept in train, it has been proposed that there will be a procedure. It will involve 2/3 in the House, and it won't involve a referendum. Those are procedural requirements. Now, in our submission, there is really nothing in that approach which anyone could say falls foul of a requirement to subserve self-determination or democracy. Far from it. Both those matters are matters which can be chosen. A chamber can choose what supermajority. A chamber can choose whether or not to have a referendum. Now, it may be that in a case which I hope never comes to pass, there will be a constitutional challenge, not on a recognition basis, but on an internal or a contradiction basis, of a law requiring, say, 100% of all members, regardless of their illness and incapacity to attend, for example. Just as one hopes that there will never be, again, a need to consider a referendum requirement that is obviously for all voters registered, not just for those who turn up, as being at 100%. These are, in our submission, arguments from abuse of a kind which the court doesn't need to consider. It does need to consider, to return to my attempted answers to Justice Young, it does need to consider whether there's anything about section 160 as it stands which A, will continue to operate if we can amend by legislation, amend the amendment provisions by legislation. We've attempted just to remove the referendum provisions, not the other provisions. And the next question is, if that were so, together with the unrealistic referendum provisions, wouldn't that also need to be rendered inoperative and ineffective so as to ensure that self-government and democracy will be served by there being a real, substantive capacity to amend the amendment provisions? Amending amendment provisions sounds black letter technicality that only lawyers could love, but it's not, because after a constitution has been made, or in this case recognised, after an unlawful making, that is the means by which the people make their constitution, and the only means. Indeed, this constitution, among its rebarbative provisions, is the bland assertion, as you will have noticed, in subsection 2(5), that it can't be abrogated or suspended by any person. Worse, in subsection 6, an attempt to establish a government other than compliance with this constitution shall be unlawful. These are statements made, if I may say so, in the confident expectation that there's no one throwing thunderbolts, because they are utterly contrary to the behaviour of the people in question. But what they say with respect is that the Constitution, as you would expect from a supreme law, and there can only be one operating at a time, as you'd expect from a supreme law, it can be amended. And so amendment of amendment provisions is a critical living part of the people's control of their form of government, that is self-determination. Your Lordships, may I remind you of a reference that I think we gave in writing concerning the notion of what has been called in some of the literature informal procedural unamendability, an impressive phrase which gives some polysyllables to the simple proposition that 160 with its referendum requirements is impossible in practical terms. That particular reference is in an article which, with respect, we commend by Professor Toomey, called Amending the Constitution of Fiji, and at page 3 you'll find it in the Human Rights Commission's bundle of authorities at tab 29. It was proposed by the amicus that the court could, as it were, give permission and guidance for a process of constitutional improvement. And we suppose that might be based upon an understanding of what very remarkably and no doubt very beneficially occurred in the Manitoba case. But in our submission, and there is another example of that perhaps in Garissay, where Manitoba was cited to that effect. But in this case, what one couldn't do is to say that the 2013 Constitution applies, but is to be put on skids by edict of this court. If it applies, no doubt in a hygienic sense that its bad bits don't apply, then it applies. And this court can't, in interpreting and applying the Constitution, say in effect, but you've got to get rid of it by a holus bolus reconsideration of it. The nation can always consider, one hopes there are people who are always considering the desirability of their current form of Constitution. But with respect, there is no remit whatever for this court under this jurisdiction to give an opinion to the effect that the Constitution will obtain for some limited period during which something has to be done. It's not like translating English statutes into French. In particular, how would the court mark the work of those who went away to do things by way of considering matter? Why would the court be a contributor directly to the making of a new Constitution, all under the guise of interpreting and applying the present one? I've said enough, I think, to encapsulate my response to the arguments you heard this morning about and also in favour of a warts and all approach to efficacy or recognition, more properly recognition. In our submission, there is absolutely no reason why an illegitimate constitution in its foundation, rendered legitimate in the sense of governing by the combination of efficacy and recognition, should be less open to interpretation of its provisions in their possible internal contradictions than a constitution which was made in an exemplary fashion from the beginning. It cannot be that efficacy and recognition provide some insulation against the ordinary consideration by way of interpretation of whether there are, for example, matters of internal self-contradiction, in this case between self-determination and democracy on one hand, and prohibited amendment of constitutional amendment provisions on the other. That is contrary to principle, surely, and would be very bad policy of the law. in this country. And it's for those reasons that there is no principled obstacle to the reception in, or the devising in the common law of Fiji of the approach which we have tried to address in response to Justice French's inquiries. Could I briefly turn to matters which may or may not affect these principal questions upon which I've replied to date? If I must adopt American nomenclature, I don't know what preferred meaning we're up to, 2.0 or whatever, in relation to these provisions, but can I say this? There are two matters of interpreting provisions in Chapter 11 which have arisen and divide those at the bar table. The amicus, we think, proposes as both plainly correct and the better view, or is it perhaps in the other order, the reading of 1592C, whereby there can be changes to its provisions, which currently simply prohibit amending Chapter 11, including 159 and 160, which will not fall foul of the prohibition in 1592C because it won't alter the effect of those provisions. Textually, something was sought to be made of the fact that the notion of effect, the word effect, is not to be found in paragraphs A and B. If it might be assumed, though it is very difficult to imagine, what difference might appear, we need simply contemplate that what, for example, the bill, as a matter of parliamentary fact, attempted to do, or is attempting to do, is plainly altering the effect of 1592C. The bill is a living demonstration of altering the effect. The effect is to prohibit, and the bill says, here we go, we're doing it. And so there's absolutely nothing in that point by the Law Society that should be rejected. The amicus, with great respect, is wrong in saying it's a better view, or it's plainly right. Perhaps more tellingly for our argument about 160, if the court gets to that concerning contradiction of self-determination and democracy with its unrealistic referendum supermajority, perhaps more tellingly is the argument concerning the denominator, to use the expression I coined in chief. I don't want to rehearse the arguments which we have set out in our written submissions in reply in particular. It is clear that all the members means all the members of Parliament. It doesn't mean all the members present. It doesn't mean all the members voting. It means of all the members. And that's surely protective of democracy because it means that weight will be given to the fact that people abstained, for example, or as they've just done in the United States, decamped Texas for Illinois or whatever. You've got to get, in order to get democratic imprimatur, you've got to get a majority of the members. Now, that in our submission really means that there's nothing in the notion that you'd read that down. But this becomes all the more telling when you come to the denominator argument applicable to the referendum supermajority provisions. It doesn't say all the voters who voted. It says of all the registered voters. And registered voters notoriously don't all vote, even when it's compulsory. So the words are intractable and mean what they say. Again, if one could pretend for a moment that these are words coming from people solicitors of democratic will, then you would say, well, of course, the reading that gives the plain, ordinary meaning to of all registered voters is the one that would have to be preferred, though there was never any choice and there is no ambiguity. But the telling point is this: the energy put into that argument by the amicus, by the Law Society, really betrays the impulse that drives the argument, namely, it is distinctly unattractive to have for the referendum 75% of registered voters, as opposed, say, to the still formidable, but certainly less requirement of 75% of those who voted. And that very impulse shows an understandable unease about the unrealistic nature of the literal, ordinary, and we would say, cynical purpose of those provisions, which was to ensure a very high number, 3/4 of registered voters in an electorate that didn't have to vote. And it,
and leaving aside the better meaning argument, on the amendment provision requirement, a vote supported by 74.9% of those who voted would fail to be enough to vary a constitution imposed by diktat.
that's right. It is, in our submission, offensive to the norms by which we have been considering how this constitution, these provisions square with not merely idealistic but everyday realities of self-government and democracy. We finally were, not finally here, but with respect to the amicus, we were finally troubled by understanding what it was is being proposed by the amicus argument this court should do. It would be a travesty to answer the question A, yes, because it said answering it no will leave a gap in the capacity to amend. As I've explained, of course it doesn't leave a gap in the capacity to amend. An unamendable constitution under Fijian law, as we've urged it to be, can't happen. That means for a constitution to be a constitution, you have to be able to amend it. And the obvious source of power, if nothing else is required in the constitution, is the Parliament, which after all enacts the act, which, if there were a referendum, goes to the people. If there's no referendum, simply becomes effective. There is no gap, but in our submission, that leaves entirely up in the air what it is proposed by the amicus should happen. Worse, is it proposed that there should be a dismissal on the basis that there is some other jurisdiction that might be exercised, including a trial where there can, in accordance with the rules of evidence, be an investigation of the last dozen years or more with respect to the government of this country. That, in our submission, is quite contrary to the intent and manifest convenience of one of the good provisions of the 2013 Constitution, which is the set of provisions giving you jurisdiction today. In particular, it should be exposed and rebutted that this court could properly answer the question by, at the anterior stage, well, we'll recognise this constitution if, and then by means that's not explained, something can be removed from it. That's an answer to those who say you can't have selective recognition. Of course you can, otherwise you are requiring the court to impose a constitutional instrument that contains immediately contradictions which, had the Constitution been made in a proper fashion, would immediately have been open for textual interpretation. The Chief Justice asked, apropos some of those arguments, whether there were not relevant differences between interpreting and amending. Of course there are, but what matters for present purposes is that a court's interpretation of a constitution may well come as a surprise to people, particularly non-lawyers, who've just been reading the text. And in this case, if you just read 1592C, you'd say, well, what this bill attempted is illegal, can't happen, it's prohibited. But the court says, but on a proper interpretation, that clashes irreconcilably with self-determination and democracy, and as a matter of interpretation it goes. Lay people could be forgiven for saying, well, by whatever name, it's amended what I formerly understood was the meaning of this text. I hope most of them would say, and a good thing too. But it won't be amendment illegitimately by the court, is my point. It will be changing perceptions by those who hadn't previously thought of and approved the argument of what the Constitution means, but it won't amend the Constitution.
I suppose if one would shore up your approach to 160 through the recognition mechanism, one might say that there are two constructions open for 160. One is that it doesn't apply to itself. The other is that it does apply to itself, and that it would be appropriate to recognise 160 consistently with self-determination and the rest of it, interpreted according to that the latter construction, that is, it doesn't apply to itself.
That's right. That is a technique that is perfectly open with great respect. And as your lordships know, I say you don't have to do it by that method, because simply as a matter of reading the text, no one should seriously contemplate that 160 of its own force applies to that which was forbidden.
I'm not sure about that. I think there's room for debate with the words any provision of this Constitution in section 160 subsection 7, but we don't have to have that debate if we go that route.
That provision certainly doesn't encompass section 160 applying to 1592C provisions, because everything in that subsection is forbidden of occurring. And that is what the text intended. When you take that out because it's too bad to stand, you don't thereby alter 160. I don't want to repeat myself, but I do accept with great respect that the critical recognition approach would extend exactly as your Lordship has proposed.
An interpretation of 160 that I would have thought is possible is that it should be read as if it said, with the exception of any provisions that, in relation to any provisions that can be amended, the following procedure applies.
That's what it does say.
Well, yeah, but if...
It is what it does say. 1591 says that.
Yes, but if section 160 is treated as if it applies only to provisions that can be amended,
yes,
then the excision of section 1592, is it B or
C?
C, doesn't really add much to it, does it?
Oh, it opens the door to amendment. You don't need 160 to amend.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. You say that if you take out that, but if you construe section 160 as intended to apply to provisions that can be amended.
Well, that's what...
that is, I express generally, i.e., those not specifically
I'm so sorry, Your Lordship. I'm so sorry. So, can be amended, including as a result of the excision of 1592C. If you read it that way, and I don't want to repeat me saying that's not how a severance would operate, but if you read it that way, then of course we go back into the familiar territory. But as it is, it should not certainly be accorded recognition, or, as I would put it, it should be read so as not to impose these practically impossible requirements, because that would be giving with one hand, taking with the other. Giving a right to amend, but taking away any practical prospect of it being successful. But I repeat myself. Could I turn to a couple of matters that my friends for interveners raised this afternoon? Pache Mr Singh's exposition of the position, it follows that the outcome and future possibilities that we've argued can't seriously be described as mayhem. In quite a different way, the notion of the Ngarazay approach mandating this court building a bridge back to 1997, to legality of 1997, ought to be rejected, not least, if you'll forgive me the corny reference, not least because lots of waters float under that bridge, but far more importantly, but because that would involve this court becoming, as it were, the steward of constitutional remaking by the nation in a way that the jurisdiction simply does not permit, and certainly could not be ordered by this court. It follows from what we've argued, the mainspring of our argument, that with great respect we accept the significance, the basal significance of self-determination, including as a human right recognised at both treaty and non-treaty levels internationally, but more to the point in this country. We accept all of that entirely. We simply jib at the idea that there is some error in our argument because our argument doesn't involve entrenching here and now, such important value as self-determination. The same could be said of democracy. But of course, the fact that self-determination means that 1592C will no longer stand in the way of constitutional amendment doesn't, with respect, mean that there cannot be, according to democratic choice, entrenchment and protection of those exceedingly important values. And that, in our submission, again, we should beware of interpretation or argument by imagined abuses for which there is no suggestion at all in the record or outside the court. Quite simply, a two-thirds majority in Parliament is a form of entrenchment. The Law Society, in supplementary address, proposed that the court might express in obiter that, and this supplements the amicus with respect to the extra constitutional supersession argument, the court could propose either by way of a what I call Cyprus necessity, for the amicus it was not such an emergency, the civilised discourse of the Irish after they'd stopped fighting each other. It has to be said that neither of those lend themselves to an answer of interpretation and application by this court. In particular, the idea of this court responding to the amicus saying, yes, these provisions bind so that you cannot amend the amendment provisions. But in obiter, if enough people take to the street without violence so as to have a constitution made from the ground up without antecedent legal authority, then it'll be different. But that really is saying nothing different from, if things change, things will change. Your job is to give an opinion for Cabinet to consider with respect to the operation of this Constitution and as to the lawful limits of what may be done under it. Hence the rule of law observance in the Cabinet asking a question, is what we have done, which is openly in breach of what the Constitution appears to prevent, is that in fact prevented by these provisions? We seek the answer, no, it's not prevented. And it is, in our submission, quite beyond a judicial role in interpreting and applying this Constitution, and very dangerous for this court to say of the supreme law, with its Ozymandias hubristic permanence by self-declaration, to say of that, and by the way, you can always, by manner familiar throughout history, quite often involving sans-culottes with pitchforks, change it. That is not a proper answer for this constitutional court to give. And it is a reversion to what I might call a realpolitik of constitutional scholarship, which is to be deprecated, Of course, there can be rebellions, revolutions, invasions, conquests, but their lawfulness at the time they are committed is always absent. And in our submission, this court would not have a bar of obiter suggestions that perhaps the people can, in what the amicus gracefully calls an extra-constitutional supersession, fix things. We understand the argument is a consolation. Yes, this constitution purports forever. They use the word ever, shall not ever be amended. Yes, this constitution utters that expression, but don't worry, nothing lasts forever, which is true, to think all of our observations in and out of court. But that's not an answer to the constitutional question here. And the notion that the poet's contemplation of the remains of Ozymandias' massive statue could be any real consolation in the context of this argument is one which is truly bleak, which says nothing about self-determination, supplies no support for democracy, and does nothing to resolve the evident contradiction that you will find between these impugned provisions and the fundamental values explicit and implicit in the Constitution elsewhere. Would your Lordships just forgive me while I abbreviate matters? May it please the Court.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. What we'll do now is we'll adjourn. Judgment was supposed to be given on the 5th of September. However, I've been told judgment will be given on notice before then. Thank you.